things I've known and breaks through
The movie begins with an old man named Walt Kowalski, a retired Polish-American Ford automobile assembly line worker. He was also a Korean War veteran, haunted by the memories of that conflict. He lived with his Labrador Retriever Daisy in a Highland Park, Michigan neighborhood, dominated by immigrants. When the movie starts, Walt attending the funeral ceremony. It was his wife Dorothy's funeral, bristling at the shallow eulogy of young Father Janovich. Likewise, he had little patience with his two sons, Steve and Mitch, and their families, who show little regard for Walt's grief or the memory of their dead mother. They considered him an irritable and opinionated old man for them. After his wife's death, Walt became isolated and emotionally detached from his family due to his dogmatic nature. Throughout the movie, we got to know that all the relatives and family members are spoiled, rude, and selfish. None of them ever showed him support unless they needed him for their own interest in paying some attention. Also, he used to dislike his Asian neighbors, but somehow developed a bond with their son, Tao Vanglor. After the funeral, many guests visited Walt's house. Walt was disappointed by the behavior of his grandchildren, who were rude and insensitive. All the neighbors of Walt were either poor Southeast Asian immigrants or gangsters, including Walt's next-door neighbors, the Vanglor family. Walt was pissed to see his neighbors outside his home and walked inside his garage, where he found his granddaughter smoking a cigarette. On seeing him, Ashley tried to divert him by asking about his vintage car. She asked him who would own the car once he died. This enraged Walt more. Meanwhile, a boy from next door arrives at the house asking Walt for jumper cables, but Walt shut the door on him. Father Janovich, his late wife's priest, tried to console him, and mentioned that Dorothy wanted him to go into confession someday. But Walt showed reluctance to the idea, implying that the father is a young and immature boy. After the service, everyone left Walt's house. On the other hand, Walt sees the Vanglor family next to his door celebrating the birth of their newborn bae. Later on, Father Janovich again comes to meet Walt, but Walt dismisses him yet again. Then, Tao Vanglor was walking on the road. Meanwhile, he was being bullied by some thugs on the street. This gang was run by Tao's cousin, Spider, who arrived on time and saved him from the bullies. Soon, Spider with his gang outside Tao's house, forcing him to join their gang. Tao agreed as he had no other choice. The gang members then asked Tao to steal his neighbor Walt's 1972 Gran Torino, which had a Cobra jet engine, from his garage. The gang then went to see Walt's treasured car and obsessed over it. One night when Walt was spending time with his friends at a bar, Father Janovich appeared again as he promised Dorothy to keenly observe Walt. He again reminded him of her wish. Walt berates Janovich for not knowing what life and death actually mean. Later that night, Walt caught Tao stealing his treasured Gran Torino. In his fury, Walt grabbed his rifle, loaded it, and headed to his garage. He caught him red-handed, but Tao fled before he could grab him. At night, Spider and his gang arrived at Tao's house when Tao and his sister, Sue, were spending time. Spider again forced Tao to come along with them, and attempted to steal Walt's car. However, Tao's family resisted, and in the process of stopping Spider from taking Tao, it created a mess resulted in spectacle outside the house. Fortunately, Walt came out of his house this time, and used his rifle to drive away Spider and his gang, earning the Vanglor family's respect. The next morning, the Vanglor family filled Walt's porch with flowers. Instead of getting happier with their gesture, Walt was offended by everything and threw it in the garbage. His neighbors considered Walt a hero for saving Tao, who apologized to Walt for what he did. But Walt refused to accept his apology, and warned him to stay away from his property. In the afternoon, Father Janovich arrived to meet Walt after finding out he was in trouble. He asked Walt why he didn't call the cops, to which Walt replied that he learned during the war how to react to situations immediately. Later, when Tao's sister Sue was out on the street with her friend Trey, 3 gangsters appeared and started harassing her. Walt was passing by in his truck, so he helped Sue from the thugs by flaunting his gun at them. On the way home with Sue, Walt suggested Sue to stop hanging with her cowardly friend Trey and make friends from her Asian community. The two of them made a good bond, when Sue told him that her family had migrated to the Midwest, due to the aftermath of the Vietnam War. Later, when Walt was sitting on his porch, he noticed Tao helping the old woman pick up her groceries. Then, Mitch and his wife Karen visited Walt on his birthday. They brought a birthday gift, and persuaded Walt to shift to a community center to overcome his isolation. Walt boiled with anger, and kicked them out of his house. Mitch and Karen regretted coming to Walt and left the house in anger. Then, Walt returned to the porch, and enjoyed a beer with Daisy. Meanwhile, Sue saw him alone and invited him to a barbecue party at her house. At first, Walt hesitated to go but then considered drinking with strangers than drinking alone. At the Vanglor's house, Walt received a warm welcome from the guests. Sue took Walt to the food table, and Walt was delighted to see the delicious food. However, he felt uncomfortable when one of the men from the Lore family, Shaman, kept staring at him continuously. After a moment, he approached Walt, and told him that no one liked him due to his opinionated nature. He also revealed that Walt had made a mistake in his past life with which he was unsatisfied, which is why he wasn't at peace. Suddenly, Walt felt overwhelmed, and experienced a coughing fit with blood. He tried to hide this from Sue, and rushed towards the washroom. When she questioned him, Walt lied to her, and the two went back to the party, which Walt enjoyed. Then, Sue took him to the basement, where he mingled with a girl named Yua. He then saw Tao, sitting alone secluded, and made him realize that Yua liked him. Walt gave him dating advice and told him that he shouldn't let some random boys hit on her. After this party, the Hmong people kept showering Walt with flowers, and food he liked. One day, Tao's mother decided that Tao should work for Walt as punishment for his actions. Walt refused to have Tao on his property but agreed with Sue's continuous insistence. From now onwards, Tao used to work for Walt. Instead of making him do his chores, Walt asked Tao to fix all the disoriented things in the neighborhood. Meanwhile, Walt again experienced a coughing fit with blood, and he gave Tao off that day. Then he visited the doctor, and got all his tests done. Walt called his son Mitch to inform him about his disappointing medical results. But before he could say anything, Mitch mentioned that he was busy. After that, Walt decided not to bother his mean sons and kept the truth to himself. The next day, Walt saw Spider's gang passing by the street in their car. Walt reached into his jacket and pulled his hand out suddenly, as if he were drawing a gun to scare off the thugs. Later, Tao arrived back at Walt's house for work. He took him to his garage, where Tao was amazed to see hundreds of tools. When Tao told him that he never saw so many tools, he gave him 3 basic tools that would help him fix anything. Suddenly, Walt again coughed up blood, making Tao worried about his health. But Walt distracted Tao from this topic, by asking about Spider's gang motive. When Tao told him they wanted his Gran Torino, Walt was surprised and laughed. Over time, Walt and Tao developed a mutual respect, and special bonding. Although, Walt kept embarrassing Tao for being a coward boy, one day when Walt was making Tao learn gardening, Tao asked him to quit smoking as it's injurious to his health. Walt diverted the topic by saying that he should go to school to study. When Tao explained that he couldn't afford to go to school, Walt suggested him to get a job. Then, Walt decided to take Tao to his friend Martin, a barber, and asked him to man up Tao. Tao was asked to enter a shop acting like a real man after Walt and Martin gave him some advice. Later, Walt took Tao with him to his friend Tim's construction site and helped him get a construction job. Tao acted all manned up in front of Tim, and impressed him enough to get a job. When returning home, Walt bought some construction essentials for Tao. Then Spider's gang again appeared, forcing Tao and attacking him on his way home from work. When Walt saw bruises and injuries on Tao's face, he asked him for Spider's address, but Tao denied his help. However, Walt tracked down Spider's address, and brutally beat one of his gang members as a warning. Later, while having a barbecue party with the Vanglor family, Walt was happy to find out that Tao asked Yua for a date. Out of generosity, he offered Tao his Gran Torino for the date night. Later, Spider's gang opened fire at the Vanglor family's house, injuring Tao. Walt raced there to check if everything was alright. Luckily, everyone was fine, but Sue happened to be missing. Eventually, Sue arrived home, and everyone was shocked to see her bruised face. Walt was devastated and furious. He returned home and couldn't stop beating around to vent his anger. That night, Father Janovich arrived to see Walt. He supported Walt's idea to seek vengeance on the assaulters, as Sue and her family refused to report the crimes. The next day, Tao arrived at Walt's house, and asked him for help to take revenge on the gang. Seeing Tao enraged, Walt calmed him down. Walt spent the whole day with himself. He mowed the lawn and groomed himself. Afterward, he went to Father Janovich to make a confession. Later on, Walt called Tao and took him to the basement and gave him his silver star that he got after the Korean War. On this, Tao questioned him about how many men he had killed. Walt revealed that he killed more than 13 men. Then, he locked Tao in the basement. When Tao insisted on letting him out, Walt told him that he still felt haunted by the memory of killing enemy soldiers, and didn't want Tao to feel the same after committing a murder. Walt handed the daisy to Tao's grandmother and informed Sue about his house keys to free Tao later. Meanwhile, Father Janovich called the cops to avoid bloodshed, but they left out after finding everything in the piece. Then, Walt reached the gang's residence. Gang members pointed their guns at Walt, drawing the attention of the neighbors. Walt berated Spider for assaulting his cousin, and then put a cigarette in his mouth. Afterward, he pulled his hand out as if drawing a gun. The gang members got alert and pierced Walt's body with multiple bullets, shooting him to death. Walt's hand opened to reveal his lighter. So, he sacrificed his own life to get them jailed for his murder. Soon, Tao and Sue arrived in Walt's Gran Torino and were shocked to see Walt's dead body. The police officer told them that the gang members were being arrested for murder. In the end, Father Janovich held Walt's funeral, which his sons and members of the Hmong community attended. After the funeral, Walt's family eagerly listened to Walt's will, and hoped to get all his property and possessions. Surprisingly, Walt left his home to the church and his Gran Torino to Tao. In this end, the movie showed Tao driving the Gran Torino with Daisy. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like, share and subscribe to our channel. Stay tuned, as we will come up with much more new and exciting movie recaps like this. Till then, goodbye.